Hello everybody, welcome back. We are in our series of videos discussing inflation. And in the last video, we looked at the Consumer Price Index, what it was, how it's calculated, and did some examples to do some practice problems there. So if you haven't checked that one out, go ahead and go watch that video. In this video, we're going to talk about a couple topics on inflation. One, why the Consumer Price Index, why its measurement of inflation commonly is thought to overstate the actual increase in the cost of living. And then we'll just mention a few of the other price indices other than the Consumer Price Index on other ways that can be used to measure the price level in an economy. And then in the next video, we're going to move on to deflation, hyperinflation, and kind of some other basically situations when inflation is not normal. But let's jump in here to the overstatement of inflation through the Consumer Price Index. So it's commonly thought to overstate inflation for two primary reasons. First is substitution bias, and the second are quality improvements. So substitution bias, recall from the last video, the Consumer Price Index is measured by fixing the quantity of goods, fixing the basket of goods. And I gave an example of the grocery store where you could go to the grocery store and you can fix the basket, say that you have a gallon of milk, a carton of eggs, some carrots, and some tortilla chips. And that's your basket, and you're measuring the cost of that basket every single month for years. But suppose if you're trying to think of that as the inflation rate for that basket, because it's fixed, those are the goods you're always going to be measuring. But suppose those tortilla chips increase in cost. What a lot of consumers are going to do is switch away from tortilla chips to some other kind of snack. Maybe they'll switch to some other kind of chip or crackers or otherwise a different snack. And when they do that, they're going to find something that fits still within the same budget. So even though your inflation rate measures the cost of that basket is no longer the basket for the average consumer. So if you have people moving substantially away from the tortilla chips and other snacks, that CPI inflation rate is going to overstate the actual increase in the cost of living because my budget hasn't increased because of the tortilla chips. I've just switched to a different type of good. And then this can happen broadly in the economy as well. Think about an example of an increase in the cost of gasoline or transportation in general. If the cost of gas goes way up, then maybe I might start biking to work or maybe move closer to work next year. And so biking or walking. And so if the cost of gas goes way up, my budget or my cost of living might not necessarily increase because I can substitute away to different modes of transportation or to a different house which is closer to my work. And that can happen in all types of the categories of goods and services across an economy. But again, because it's a fixed basket, that isn't going to change to reflect the actual increase in the cost of living. So that's this idea of substitution bias, our first mechanism through which CPI is overstated. And the second are quality improvements. So if some inflation rate is measuring the cost of, take a Honda Civic for an example. And in 2015, let's say that Honda Civic costs $24,000. And in 2010, it cost $20,000. It looks like the cost of the Honda Civic has increased by $4,000 or 20%. But these two Honda Civics are not necessarily an apples-to-apples comparison. The new one may have substantial quality improvements in safety, fuel economy, electronics, and so on and so forth. And so, therefore, these aren't really the same car. If the 2010, the earlier version Honda Civic, had the same features, the same safety, the same fuel economy, and so on and so forth, that 2010 Honda Civic may have cost $22,000 instead of $20,000. And so instead of an increase of $4,000, the apples to apples comparison may only be an increase of $2,000. This idea could also be thought of with cell phones. So if you are measuring the cost of living and you see it increases substantially because of cell phones, if you take a cell phone today versus 10 or 15 years ago, the newer cell phones have all sorts of quality improvements and new features, like, for example, a camera, a GPS, and all sorts of other apps. And so by having a cell phone today, that prevents me from needing to buy a camera, a GPS, and some of these other features that a cell phone offers. And as such, if I'm not buying all of these other things, then again, the consumer price index will overstate my actual cost of living because I'm not buying all of these kind of quality improvement type goods separately. Okay, so that's the two ideas for the overstatement of inflation: substitution bias and quality improvements. Why does this matter? So, especially in the United States, this first bullet is going to be most important. Social Security benefits and federal pensions hinge on inflation. And so when people retire and they start collecting Social Security, they get a check from the government every year. And because we have inflation, the government has to increase what they pay to the retirees in order to compensate them for their extra cost of living. But if they use the consumer price index, and if the consumer price index is overstating the cost of living, then that means the federal government is sending out more money than it needs to in order to compensate the beneficiaries for their extra cost of living. And so this has certainly implications for the sustainability of these types of Social Security programs and pensions. Same thing could be said for COLAs, cost of living allowances. Not quite as common in the United States, but essentially contracts or clauses written into labor contracts, for example, to say that your wage will be increased by the consumer price index inflation rate every year. A little bit more common in Europe, but again, if the consumer price index is overstating inflation, that means the administrators of these plans are paying out more than necessary in order to compensate the people for their actual increase in the cost of living. Even if the overstatement is small, for very large programs like the Social Security program, even very small changes can make big differences over millions of people and years of time. Okay, so that's the overstatement of CPI. A couple more topics here about inflation. For this video, we're going to look at core inflation and a few of the other price indices to round out this video. Core inflation excludes relatively volatile economic variables from CPI, like food and energy. Food and energy prices swing a lot more than the other goods in the economy. So you can look at total inflation, but you can also look at core inflation to get a better sense of how are the prices of other things like housing and clothes and medical care and education and things like this. How are their prices changing apart from food and energy, which often have big influences on total inflation. Okay, and finally, the last bit for this video are other price indices. We talked about CPI, the Consumer Price Index. There's also PPI, Producer Price Index, International Price Index, Employment Cost Index, And one of the more common ones in economics is the GDP deflator. And so for this kind of introductory level of macroeconomics, it's sufficient enough just to know that these other measurements exist. Just as we have different measurements to measure the health of the labor market, other than the unemployment rate, like the labor force participation ratio, the employment population ratio, and so on and so forth, we also have other ways to measure prices. And depending on kind of what segment of the economy you're interested in, if you are a manufacturer or you have a company, some of these other indices might be more useful. And then the GDP deflator is also another one, whereas with the consumer price index, which has a fixed basket of goods and it allows prices to fluctuate, GDP deflator essentially has fixed prices and allows quantities to fluctuate. And it just gives kind of slightly different numbers, usually slightly lower than the consumer price index. So talking about the overstatement of inflation, GDP deflator may be a slightly better measurement to avoid that overstatement. Okay, but in any case, just simply knowing that these exist, not necessarily getting into the nitty-gritty details of all of them, is sufficient for this lecture series, but would be covered more in kind of a more advanced intermediate macroeconomics course. Alright, so that's all we're going to do for this video. In the next video, as mentioned, we're going to be looking at when inflation is not normal, either when it's negative, which we call deflation, or when it's extraordinarily high, which is hyperinflation. Okay, thanks, and I will see you there.